Just say, hey, you're listening to Cult of Reason. Just say something like that.
I can't do it right now.
I believe virtually everything I read, and I think that is what makes me more of a selective human than someone who doesn't believe anything.
Cult of Reason.
We're all monkeys.
Apes don't read philosophy.
Yes, they do, Otto. They just don't understand it.
Cult of Reason.
The only true wisdom consists in knowing that you know nothing. That's us, dude.
I anticipate a deeply religious experience.
Interesting way to open up a conversation.
Hey everybody, welcome to Cult of Reason. This is Mark Pankinen. This episode is kind of like my own personal book club. I recently read a great memoir called Songs Only You Know by an author named Sean Madigan Hoen. The book chronicles Sean's life from his late teens to mid-20s. He's in a hardcore band in Detroit at that time in the late 90s called Thoughts of Ionesco. And it covers their rise in notoriety in the local hardcore music scene and all the insane, eccentric characters in that universe. But the music stuff's really more of a backdrop for the main focus of the book, which is Sean describing his battle with some dark issues in his life at that time, and covers a lot of themes like mental illness, family chaos and tragedy, substance abuse, and just a lot of emotional pain and primal rage he was dealing with at the time. It's a really well-written book, very somber in tone, but also nuanced with some dark humor in it as well. It's tough to describe a book, and I definitely can't do it justice, so I have an example here from Rolling Stone magazine, which was one of many positive reviews it got when it came out. They say, nuanced and poetic, it's funny at times, always brutally honest, a half-healed bruise, tender and multicolored. Few books convey the fever pitch, intensity of youth with such vividness and so little glamorization, or as deeply explore the heartbreaking complexity of family. Sounds good, right? So I was halfway through the book, and on a whim, I just decided to look up Sean and sent him an email asking him out of the blue if he was ever back home in Detroit. He was in New York teaching at the time. If he would ever consider doing my podcast. I wasn't really expecting to get an answer back from him, but to my surprise, he responded and said he was in the process of moving back to Detroit and he'd be happy to do the podcast. So I was already into the book at this point, but now I'm super into the book because I know I might meet Sean and get to talk to him about the book. So I finished the book, and I even read it through, kind of skimmed through it a second time, and I was really excited to meet him. So it was a little weird at first, meeting a total stranger, yet knowing so many intimate details about his life from this book. And I was a little intimidated by him just based on the intense portrayal of him in this book, and then all this, the normal nervousness I get when I do these things because I'm so new at it. But once the initial jitters faded away, we settled into a conversation pretty naturally, and just had a great time talking to him. I think, I don't have any of his, anything close to Sean's creative talents, but in some ways we're kind of similar, I think, with our personalities, at least maybe with our introspective tendencies, and definitely have overlapping interests, in psychology and culture and art. So I really enjoyed our conversation. Sean's a very thoughtful guy, extremely well-read, and it was fun to hear his take on some things that we both are interested in, and just the amount of references that he brings up that I might not have ever come across, without having this conversation. It was worthwhile just for that reason alone. And I will say that on the website, cultofreason.life, I will list in the show notes all the stuff that comes up as a reference if anybody wants to go back and look at it. I know I definitely will use that as a resource to go back and read some of the things that come up in our conversation. So without any more delay, here is my conversation with Sean Madigan Hoen. of Ionesco a little bit, in my research. I wasn't really into the hardcore scene back then. But goddamn, like it's you talked a lot about Repa in the book and how good a drummer he is. Repa?
Yeah.
I'm bummed that I didn't see you guys reunited until it was too late. So you already had that show at the Magic Stick.
Yeah.
I would have loved to come see you guys play.
Yeah. That wound up feeling surprisingly good.
Well, it's I was surprised. I read an interview about you from 2014, and you mentioned like it seems ridiculous to ever reunite, with the band, and to see you reunite, but not just reunite and play your old songs, but you guys wrote all new material for that, right?
We wrote 3 new songs.
3 new songs.
And played one of them, but it was mostly playing the old stuff.
Okay.
But you're not the first person to mention that this is something you said you'd never do, and I definitely had arrived at a place where it was just not even within the realm of the possible. I think maybe I got so far away from it that it felt okay, or I think things politically were putting me in a spot where I did a lot of volunteering, but I had a lot of excess energy I didn't know what to do with, and it just felt right for some reason.
Well, I mean, can't think of a better outlet for excess energy than that kind of music, It's not easy music to write. I mean, it's super complicated, both technically, musically, and very dense lyrics, and so it seems like that'd be challenging to go that long outside of that type of music and just to jump back in and write songs again, but they sounded really good. Which of the new EP, so I listened to Culture of the Permanent Snake.
Eternal Snake.
Eternal Snake. Was that new or old?
That's new.
That was one of the new ones?
Yeah.
And that's a complicated song, man. Like, how long does it take for you to write a song like that?
Well, the funny thing about that band is that was basically the first band I was ever in, so maybe in some kind of native sense, like the closest to it's the first thing I knew as far as playing. After that, I tried to go back and figure out how to write songwriting and verses and choruses and all this other stuff that was a lot harder for me. But like you said, I hadn't played that kind of music in 17 years. And I was surprised when I picked up the guitar to start writing for the session, like it came right back. Yeah. Those particular chord shapes and those structures and the long kind of epic song arrangements. And it actually came out very easily, which surprised me.
Yeah.
And the physicality of the music I was a little worried about with the show in particular.
It's a pretty high bar to live up to, right? You guys are pretty notorious for your...
Yeah, and also for me, doing that vocal after having not done it for 18 years, I blew myself out in the studio, and I was worried, like, this is going to last for an hour and a half. Our shows in the 90s were usually about half an hour.
Okay.
So
I can't imagine. Like, I couldn't scream one word of one of your songs. Like, literally one word. I couldn't make that noise. So, like, to scream for a whole set just seems to be... Did you ever run into problems with, like, vocal cord polyps?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think my voice... I teach now, and sometimes I'll notice it breaking down in class, and I wonder if there's some permanent kind of damage, but...
Have you gotten a scope, like an ENT doc?
I have had all that stuff in the past, but it held up for the show, surprisingly.
Yeah. All that adrenaline can get you through.
I guess it can work on the throat, too.
Yeah, it works everywhere.
The mic helps, too. You can we pulled it off. I felt really good about it, which was surprising to me.
You know, when you read the book, and I won't get into too many details for people that haven't read the book, if they're going to read it, but there's obviously a lot of drama and chaos and pain that you go through, that you document, and I can see that being a big source of the kind of, primal, screaming type of music that you play. But you were kind of into that stuff before all that stuff really went down with your dad and everything else. So, like you said, you were listening to Black Sabbath at like the age of 12. You don't have an older brother. Like, what got you into that kind of music at such a young age?
I think when you say stuff with my family was happening later. I mean, whenever it's something in that magnitude, it's kind of a glacial thing leading up to it. So all that stuff was kind of happening my whole life. It just hadn't broke yet. And I think we were a very repressed Catholic family that didn't talk about things, and there was a lot of fear. And so I just remember being maybe 10 at the public library in Dearborn and seeing they could still take out vinyl albums, and just being really drawn to the darkest thing. I think some kind of archetypal, lizard brain thing in me was like, what's that? And I'm attracted to it. And I look back like, okay, why did I want to go right towards the album with the pentagram on the cover? Mm-hmm. Well, because that was everything we couldn't talk about at home. So heavy metal was like my gateway thing as a kid. I mean, I got into it really young, obsessed with it. And then, that led to punk and hardcore. So yeah, by the time of, high school and puberty and adolescence and all that, I was in pretty deep and just seeking it out on my own. Back then it was mail order. Mm-hmm. The SST records, which did Black Flag and the Minutemen and all that stuff. It was like this long distance thing for me, just ordering records and hiding them. And then I found out there was a scene.
You had to even hide the records?
Yeah, pretty much. Or I'd play them, and the minute my dad would come home, they'd be just off the stereo, and it was quiet time. It was that kind of situation. Mm-hmm. And then when I found there was a scene in Detroit, it was a lot of people from different suburbs, Livonia and stuff, had all this stuff going on. I was just amazed, house shows and bands of people my age doing it. So, but as far as figuring out I could scream like that, the funny thing about the band was we rehearsed. We didn't have a microphone, so I would scream into the air at first. And we recorded before we ever played a show. We recorded our first record, and so no one, including myself, had actually heard me scream. And I remember being in the vocal booth screaming and hearing the guys in the talkback room, hearing Reaper whisper to Nathan, "I told you could do it," which is funny. So I'm not sure when you learn. I think maybe it comes from a need, just being able to scream like that.
Well, I guess you realized pretty quick. I mean, I know that I couldn't do it. It's an interesting ability just to do that. But then you got to write the songs. You got to the lyrics. So, I mean, obviously you're a writer. Have you written your whole life? Were the lyrics kind of an easy part of the thing? Did you have a lot of journals and poems you wrote, or where did the lyrics come from?
I didn't write much back then when it first started. And actually my connection to literature was largely through music. I would hear, people I admired speaking about books they read, and I'd seek them out. And it was more, that was how I came into being a reader, actually. The lyrics and all that stuff, it was the kind of thing I was always jotting that stuff down in notebooks and paying attention to it. And at that time, it would just come out without any judgment, and the first thing that wound up on the paper. And usually for that band in particular, when we would we'd always record everything before we'd play it out anywhere, and the music would be all done, and I'd be reading the lyrics as I screamed them for the first time. Basically, the first time I ever screamed the song is the one you hear on the record.
Oh, really?
Record. So very just intuitive and impulsive at that time.
So when you're practicing, you're not screaming the whole time?
Well, I'd be screaming, but the words wouldn't be there yet.
Okay. So you are screaming. You practice 3 hours for 5 days a week or something? You're screaming the whole time? Jesus. Hold on, let me just get this dryer. So, again, thank you so much. It's really fun to have you here. Is there anything about the book you don't want to talk about, by the way, or anything?
No, I've talked about it all, so, yeah.
So when you first published this back in 2014, you got a lot of great reviews, deservedly, and I saw some interviews, and you were kind of doing that tour. How did that all happen? And there's not many things harder than making it in music, but making it as an author might be up there, right? If it's not an Oprah's book club, I read Hillbilly Elegy, which is getting all these awards and everybody knows about it. It's a good book, but I liked yours better. But how do you get that recognition out there? How do you get that book out there?
The world of letters is really tough right now. I mean, people are reading less. There's all these shows and medias that are calling for your attention when you come home, and people are having a harder time sitting down and with quiet and just. Reading is a very active experience. It requires something of you. I think that's why we get more out of it. I do, at least in general, reading a novel than watching a series.
Yeah.
So it's really tough out there, but I was living in New York. Me getting sober was a huge part of it. I had all this time now. I started reading a lot more. I started writing. And, New York is also the hub for literary activity in the world, pretty much. So it's a huge part of the culture there, which was great for me at that time to be around it. And it's still a place where people really care about books and talk about them. And so that was going on. I just basically, sat down and wrote on it every night for about 4 years. A lot of it was editing and just figuring out how a book should fit together, and it wasn't until I published it when I realized it was about to be published that I really started having problems with, what have I done, and this is going to be out there, and what does this mean? Because I'm kind of a private person, and here I put all this
the least private
there.
thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so honest, so personal.
And I also am aware that people in my personal life may not be readers, and I think with anything, I have my tastes as a reader, and they're not exactly commercial. And I was doing a certain thing that I realized wasn't going to be relatable to everybody. And how do I bridge that gap? And I realized I couldn't. And
you probably shouldn't even try.
This is the book I wrote, and if you can feel it, great. And if it's out of your range, it's not.
I think that's the only way to go. Same exact thing with music. Like you mentioned that struggle when you went into Holy Fire, and that battle of trying to make it more accessible versus doing what the authentic voice that you had, and that conflict. I think it's the same with anything creative. The more authentic and just honest you are, that's all you can do. And if it hits a nerve, great. I tried to write a memoir one time, which is kind of ridiculous because I don't really have anything to write a good memoir. You need a body of interesting life experiences, which you definitely have. Then you actually need the writing skills itself, and I don't really have either of those, so it's kind of a joke to try and write a memoir. But one thing I noticed when I tried was how much self-editing was going on, as I'm writing, and I was constantly thinking about how this is going to come across, and it was kind of paralyzing. I couldn't just let it flow and just write. And the more personal you get, I would think that'd be more of a problem. And so you said when you first wrote this, you were just kind of putting it all out there, and then it was later, once you started to think about it actually getting published, that you started worrying about some of the things you wrote. And how much did you go back and edit after the fact once it got close to getting published?
I didn't edit anything with the concern for changing things now that it was about to be published. But I would say I had the draft done 2 years in, and then the next 2 years were just, for me, good storytelling is really about showing a scene. So how long can I sit with this scene and remember what it looked like, what it smelled like, just putting the characters there. And obviously there's a lot of shaping going on, and this sits next to this scene because they speak to one another, but it's not exposition on the page where I'm psychoanalyzing myself and my family. It's just showing what happened.
Right.
For me, that was my way of trying to get as close to the truth as you can through memory. If you just show it as close as you can get it to as it happened, well, then it's kind of you can't really dispossess that of its, organic truth, I guess. Mm-hmm. So that for me there's not a ton of thinking on the page in that book. It's just here's this character going from this thing to this thing and this thing, which some people struggle with. I think people sometimes have an expectation of, you went through some stuff, you wrote a book about it should have a self-help kind of connotation or something, or whatever.
Like an angle.
Yeah, and to me it was just like, boy, here's a story of a young life, and so as far as the editing, it was a lot of just sitting with those scenes and what's right here, what's not right, and can I remember more, and how can I express feeling through just showing the things happening as accurately as possible, if that makes sense.
And was there any hesitancy of any of the really dark personal stuff? Was there any doubt that you were going to put that stuff in the book? Was it from the very beginning you're just going to put everything out there and just not think about it?
Well, there's stuff I didn't put in. So there was stuff I wasn't comfortable putting in. So, I guess it gets you.
That's mind-boggling. How'd you read this book and then you hear that? It's like, Jesus, what the hell was not put in there?
And a lot of the stuff that's there is, well, let's choose one time that this happened, and that will stand in for the other times. Mm-hmm. So while writing it, and also I'd read other books that had gone that far, and I felt like there was something beautiful about coming out of the other end of that. To me, there is redemption in art being done well. So that was what kept me like, why am I doing this? Well, I'm just trying to tell this story in a way that somehow will be beautiful to somebody, or make somebody feel something, or make me feel connected somehow. So I pulled a few things out, and but I guess nothing in there. Really, it was my own transgressions, that if there's something that I could go back and change, I think I leaned a little hard on making myself seem like a fuck up in order to maybe almost apologize for the fact that I was writing about other people. Maybe aired on that a little too much. I don't know if that makes sense, which wasn't something I could see at the time I was writing it.
Well, I don't know, but I mean, part of what makes the book powerful is the honesty. And when you're writing about you riding around at 4 a.m. with 2 prostitutes doing crack, that's part of, the book starts, it's just kind of like this relentless slog of tragedy. And just when you think, it can't get any darker, now you're reading about you, and now you're getting into the crack, and you know what happened with your dad, and you're like, oh my God, no, there's no way this is gonna end well. But including that stuff in the book is what makes it so powerful, and then, like you said, the redemption of coming out of it at the other end. So the book basically chronicles your life from age 17 to 25-ish. Is that about right? And what about those periods, the start and the ending dates of keeping it to that and not going a couple years later, for example? Or was that a tough decision?
That all happened pretty organically. I was just looking for a shape to reveal itself, and it started on that night when basically, in my mind, my family had to face the fact that we were changed forever. And the book does flash forward at the very end 3 years to where I've just gotten a hang on sobriety. But the shape of that story, as told in my early 30s when I began writing it, was here's kind of an odyssey, and one person's odyssey into a personal kind of hell. And so it kind of drove down to the abyss and ended was the shape of the story. And that just felt right at that time. The interesting thing about writing a book like that is if I were to start writing it now at 39 as opposed to I started it at 31, it's naturally going to change, which is a hard thing to swallow sometimes when you only get to tell your life story once, probably, unless you're Henry Miller or something. But yeah, and I mean, you mentioned a pretty difficult scene that I think maybe friends of my mom's or something like, why would anybody write about the time they smoked crack? And for me, it was the most obvious thing in the world. I mean, my sister had died. I come from a family of addicts. My dad had died a crack addict, and I had some kind of almost like Freudian obsession with I need to see this as close as I can. And that's why the character is there. And some people get that, and some people are like, why would anyone do this? So that's a hard place to put yourself in as a writer, but also the one thing I could say about that book was it's just something I had to do. And that was, at times, the only thing I could say about it was it's something I had to do, and I did the best I could.
And you think it was therapeutic in the same way that you talk about the music being therapeutic, like getting that out?
The process was, but publishing it was not. Publishing it was one of the harder things I've done, and I was in a bad spot for a little while after that. I had to figure out what that meant. So I think if you can stay connected to the process, that's always, for someone who lives a creative life, like that's the gold. What happens in the world with the result is a whole other set of problems.
Right. So let me just straighten out some details about just what happened after the book. So at the end of the book, you allude to when you're on the lake in the rain, and you guys are up north with Colgate the Conqueror. I mean, the characters in this book, man, like I was reading it, and it'd be a great movie. I'm sure that's, everybody that writes a book would love to have it turn into a movie, and it's like probably impossible. But so many of these characters are so amazing. But you're with Colgate, and you're with Scott, and you allude to, well, this isn't the worst. Like, a couple years later, I'm still struggling, but I'd like to believe this is when I first started to turn around. And then like you said, you allude that you were in Alcoholics Anonymous later on after that, and then you got clean. So you do know, reading the book, that things did turn around. So when you quit the Holy Fire, what was the time interval there from then to when you moved out to New York, and when did all the writing stuff start?
Okay. So yeah, and I mean, about those characters, a funny thing to see the book reviewed or hear it talked about sometimes is like, I think people don't believe a character like that, but the book was probably 200 pages longer in an original draft, and everything I pulled out was those characters, Reaper and Mike CTW, and
I see. I'd read that book if you put all that together in a companion book.
I just I don't need this much of these guys, but I mean, these were some really strange people, and his story carries on and just gets weirder.
Which one? Colgate?
Conquer the Colgate. And that was like the fun part for me. It was like I don't think I would have written the book had either part not been there, the family stuff or this music voyage and these eccentric people I was around.
Well,
so.
You're living in a universe that very few people ever enter, Maybe going to a hardcore show is, the most immediate group that kind of gets a taste of it. But living in that world, in that social scene, and all these characters, it's just very interesting from somebody on the outside to read about that stuff. And I can see how people would not believe that some of that. Like Reaper. So there was a part where you guys are practicing, and Reaper, he pisses in his 40, and then he drinks it, and then he gets on his throne. He's trying to take a deuce on his snare drum, and he goes through the trash. He's eating French fries out of the trash, and then he's chasing after some guy on all fours. Like this very vivid scene of it looks like somebody having like a psychotic break. And you said basically that's when you guys let him go. Was that just because he got too crazy, or what happened with that?
Yeah, we moved out of his basement, and we had a practice space in a very infamous location in Redford on 7 Mile Grand Telegraph, that little pocket there, and this is known to musicians around Detroit.
Yeah, I had a buddy that had a little space there.
And that freedom of him having that location, he was getting wild, but I think it was a hard thing to elucidate in the book, where there's a hardcore scene, and then within that, we were pretty intent on having no part of it and we were, encouraging our inner psychopaths at that time. And where can this take us to transcendence? I don't know, or oblivion. And so there was this strange staging of some of that kind of behavior, but then it began to take over. And at that point, we'd drive to Chicago. He'd play one song and smash his drums, and we'd drive home. And there's something kind of amazing about that, but also something like... So that was a moment where it was like, this is too much, even for us. And it was also the first of 3 times we kicked him out. He'd leave, someone else would come, he'd come back. So, yeah.
And it was always bittersweet because he was a great drummer, like you said. And it's like you dance with the devil that you got, but like at some point it's too much. And you gotta,
But he actually didn't play the reunion with us.
Derek Grant, right?
Yeah, but Repa was always, whether he was there or not, definitely a part of... He was part of the soul of the band and the fabric, and it would have never been that heavy if it wasn't for him. He wasn't satisfied unless it was as heavy as we could make it.
Right.
I could have gone like a Fugazi way, but I was writing a lot of that stuff to impress him.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of that. Like you guys were all trying to one up each other.
Yeah.
Like I get it when I see performances and I see, you talk about when you're performing and you took a hit of a joint that was laced with a little crack for the first time, and you get on stage and you throw the mic into the crowd and you're just screaming the lyrics into the ground. Like I can visualize that, and that's like such a badass scene. Like, and I can understand like on stage antics and like when the adrenaline and the performance aspect of it. But when you lose me is like when you're talking about like at practice, how crazy you guys are going. It's just so clear to me that you guys are just wired in a different way. And like, and those antics and that craziness, it's like you guys kind of thrived in that, and like pushing it as far as you could go.
Yeah. And I think I'd gotten far enough away from it that I could look back on it, and I don't listen to that kind of music much anymore. But I could look back on it like, that was pretty interesting. And we were always at the shows trying to meet the intensity of our practices, which I think it's often the other way around. And then another anecdote that's kind of along these lines was sometimes someone will ask, like, what was the best show you ever played? And kind of facetiously, but also there's a bit of truth in it. I remember we were playing the show in a basement in New Jersey, and we cleared the room to where it was just the 3 of us playing to each other, which would happen sometimes if we were put on the wrong bill with some pop punk or emo bands.
Yeah.
So we're in this dingy basement playing to ourselves, and then we proceeded to play harder than we've ever played, to the point where I was dry heaving at the end just from the adrenaline. And I like, for that band in a certain way, like, well, that's the best show. Just, it's not about anything but us playing to each other. So I don't know, the people I think seems like you kind of understand that intuitively, and then I think other people might be like, what the hell are they talking about?
Yeah, no, I get it. And there's something about the impermanence of it too. Like nobody saw it, it wasn't recorded, but it was the experience you had, and
with 2 other people who understand.
Yeah. And that the camaraderie, I've been in a couple bands, and the camaraderie of bandmates is a special thing. It's so cool, and especially if you're touring a lot and just spending so much time together. And I think I mentioned in our emails I knew Evan, which isn't his real name. There's like nothing but positive stuff about him in the book.
Nathan?
Why is his name different in the book? Was that like he just didn't want his name in there? Or?
Yeah, I changed 2 names, and his was one, and that was really...
He's one of the few characters that doesn't get in any trouble.
I kind of kept him a little bit, on the side, but I couldn't get a hold of him. We'd had a little period where we weren't speaking, and we were trading calls, and I kept leaving him messages, and we couldn't connect on the phone, and I started feeling like I'm just going to play it safe here. And then, of course, when it's out, he's like, well, you didn't have to do that. So
nobody knows it's me, man.
Yeah. And to answer your other question, as far as what happened after, you wanted me to fill in. I again, like talking about the composition of a book. I felt like that moment where we really were driving out there to throw a 1979 Les Paul in the lake. And another one of those strange edits that I made was, in fact, that guitar had belonged to all 3 of the people in the van, and I just felt that wouldn't be believable to a reader, too perfect. So, to me, metaphorically, that was like where it should end, And what happened after was I basically quit that band and moved to New York in a month or something, which
Was that mainly at the time to be with Angela?
Yes. Though really it was what people in recovery call pulling a geographic, which is I'm going to get up out of Dodge and this is going to be better out here. And
which is a good thing, though, right?
It doesn't solve your problems because if you're trying to get sober in New York, it's
right.
So I bottomed out in New York.
But there is something to be said about getting out of that circle,
yes, yeah,
right?
Yeah.
But then, if you replace it with something like New York, where there's even more trouble to be had.
Although I don't think I would have cleaned up in Detroit. So it kind of all, I got there and spent about 2 years, and then I got hooked up with some really great people out there who helped me on. I went back and got a master's degree, and a lot happened in New York.
So you're in school in literature, master's degree in literature?
Creative writing.
Yeah. And you're writing as you're in school.
Mm-hmm.
And you get your degree, you publish the book, and you start to get some attention for the book. And then at some point you start teaching after you get your degree?
I was teaching a little before as well.
You're also teaching before?
Well, I'm sorry. After I got my degree, yes. Before the book came out.
Okay.
And
so you were teaching in New York, and what made you decide to move back home?
My mom's here, and rent out there for someone with a, professor's wage to live in New York.
It's brutal.
You're basically going to be, living like a college student. And I did that for a while, and it was great. And I was just, looking at the financial reality if I wanted to keep clearing away time to write. And it just made more sense to be here right now. And I have a lot of community here, and they have the grind out there to make rent.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, every time I'd try to move, everything would be hiked up another $300. And I wound up living in a pretty sketchy neighborhood the last year I was there, and just realizing, well, okay, I can be that guy who teaches all week and comes home and works 2 shifts at a restaurant, or I can come back here and try to clear away more time to finish my next book. So
it makes sense. It's not like when you're acting where you kind of have to be there for the auditions. If you're writing, you can kind of be anywhere. So are you writing fiction? Are you writing, what kind of stuff are you writing now?
I'm pretty deep into a novel fiction.
What's the general idea?
It's tough. It's a big knotty plot with numerous characters, but it's very much about the zeitgeist in a lot of ways, if that's not too vague. But I feel like it's a bunch of characters all asking, like, what does it mean to actually commit oneself to changing culture in a way that really has impact. So it's people coming at that from several different angles. There's an artist, there's a Gestalt therapist, there's a pseudo kind of revolutionary, and they all kind of get entangled. So much different than writing by yourself.
Sounds interesting. Sounds complicated too. You could tell you're into a lot of psychology and philosophy. Did you ever go back and read any of Ionesco? I know when you named your band that you hadn't really read anything, somebody mentioned it to you. Have you gone back and read some of that stuff?
I did. And one curious note about the band is it's actually pronounced Eugene Ionesco.
Oh, it's Ionesco. Okay.
And we gave up real early on correcting people and just kind of let that noun become its own thing. I had read a little more than I let on in the book. I thought that was just kind of a funny sort of Philistine moment where we're naming ourselves after like a very highbrow absurdist playwright. And I was introduced to him through a great essay that Henry Miller wrote on him. But I have read that stuff, and it's really fascinating because he'll do things like change the significance of a single word within the context of a play, and it's this, kind of study of language and what words signify and what we, so I was really fascinated by that.
You ever read anything by Ernest Becker?
No.
I'm reading this book right now, Denial of Death, and I think you dig it. It gets into it's kind of the deepest question you could possibly ask of what drives human behavior at kind of a meta level, and basically it kind of gets into the psychoanalytical history with Freud, and basically kind of taking what Freud was right about and kind of getting rid of kind of the fixation on the sexuality, but basically everything that we do, including culture and our character role in culture, is ultimately as a way of repressing this fear of death. But I'm only just getting started. I can't really talk about the book too intelligently, but
that sounds great.
You should keep it in mind, something to
to
read. He won the Pulitzer in the 70s for this book, and so I decided to check it out. But
that's interesting. I mean, I'm always reading my novels, and that's one type of reading, and then I'm usually doing some other type of reading. And one of my heroes these days is this guy named Adam Phillips, who's a psychoanalyst, but he also, I would call him a philosopher. He publishes a lot of books, but he's also written a number of books kind of meditating on Freud, and he's very connected to Freud. I mean, in a pop cultural sense, we think of like three things when we think of Freud, but so much was built off what that guy did and resonates in all these ways that we may not be taking into consideration, especially in those fields. And he does a really nice job of like expanding, at least my knowledge of what stands on Freud.
Right. Yeah, everybody's heard of Freud, and you're right. It's a pop culture, very superficial idea of what his contribution to psychology was. But there's a lot there. Like it's
it's vast.
And it's something that really doesn't come up much. Like people don't talk about psychoanalysis very much anymore. And, but it's fascinating stuff to me.
Yeah, I mean, even the degree to which like Jung worked against him was, everything was then against. His whole career was basically on what he extrapolated. So
yeah, they get into that a little bit in this book. That when they split off, and Otto Rank was another guy, and Freud's inner circle kind of split off and modified all of his genius insights, and kind of discarded some of it, but a lot of it, still stands.
Yeah.
There's also a good documentary that kind of gets into this with, it's called Century of Self, and it's about this guy, Albert Bernays, who was Freud's nephew. And
he's like in advertising or something? Yeah, that's spooky.
It's really spooky because he was the first guy to kind of understand that there were practical implications of all the stuff that Freud was learning about the human psyche and our motivations. And he used those to basically figure out you can manipulate people based on their fears and their ideas of self-expression and individuality, and how you can get people that want to feel like they look a certain way or are perceived in a certain way. You can manipulate their behavior based on that. And he became famous because he his first big success was he made cigarettes attractive to women. So at the time, like, women would never smoke. It was completely unheard of, totally taboo. And the tobacco companies came to him and were like, hey, how do we start selling to women? It's half the population. And he staged this photo shoot with some naval officers, and he got these gorgeous blonde models. And he leaked it to the press that these women were going to be smoking cigarettes, which was just enough of a story there that people actually showed up. And so they had these beautiful women walk arm in arm with these officers smoking cigarettes, and close-up shots of their face. They called them freedom flames. And so he associated the cigarettes with beauty and patriotism. And the next day, when these stories came out and everybody's reading it, it became this huge fad. All of a sudden, they were just flying off the shelves. Women, now they all wanted to smoke because they wanted to be associated with this glamorous, patriotic image, And the government took notice of that, and they ended up hiring him. He became, the first public official of he thought propaganda was too shady of a word, so he called it Ministry of Public Affairs or something. And Goebbels and the Nazis, everything they did was based largely on Bernays and all this stuff. It's fascinating.
Yeah, where this is a documentary?
Yeah, it's on YouTube. It's free.
Okay.
It's by a guy. What's his name? He does a bunch of them. I'm blanking on his name, but it's good stuff.
Yeah, and here we are. Advertising is everything.
Yeah, it's kind of getting to a very perverse, weird place, right? I mean,
yes. I mean,
was that so? I kind of gather from your Facebook and kind of talking to you, kind of probably tend to go more liberal side of politics. And when I think of the hardcore scene, maybe this is a misconception, I don't know, but seems to be some kind of association with skinhead, kind of very conservative type of politics. Is that true or not true?
No, not at all. I mean, I think there was, I think that was more of like an 80s thing. There was like the Aryan skinhead hardcore thing. But for the most part, I mean, that was where I would go, and you'd play a show and there'd be some guy with dreadlocks like selling Noam Chomsky books, and something like Fugazi, who are like this total anti-corporatism,
right.
Autonomous self-sufficiency, very ethical too, like, a band who would turn down interviews in Rolling Stone because they didn't like what they advertised. So that was definitely where what I was drawn to, like pretty, I don't self-identify as liberal, but I think the boxes would be checked in every account. But for me, it was definitely, like, that's where I really got exposed to a lot of like politics that were outside of the mainstream media channels. And it's an interesting thing because like a lot, seeing it happen with people in their early teens or late teens or early 20s, for a minute it can kind of be a pose you slip on, like,
oh, for sure,
I'm a revolutionary now, and yeah, you have to go through that. But then coming back to it years later, I was like, I picked up a lot of really useful information, and I got it there through that scene and that community. So yeah, I don't know if the hardline right wing presence is there anymore in hardcore, but there was that that side of things.
Well, I think if there's one common undercurrent, it's anti-authority, anti-establishment, anti-conformity. And when you're in a scene like that, you're going to meet a lot of people that are kind of on the fringes. They're going to have their own, access to different information that you wouldn't come across otherwise. Same thing with traveling. You go traveling. I remember I was in Europe in like the early 2000s, and it was the first time I came across people that were like questioning like U.S. politics and imperialism and all this stuff. And it was something you would never come across, like, in the circles that I was with, and they're all recommending books I should read. And
yeah. I mean, New York was really great for me in that way, because it is every culture just slammed together, in these neighborhoods. And then, up where my mom lives now, in northern Michigan, so it's like the safest place in the world, but the people are more paranoid than any I've ever met. That some the governmental like fallout is going to happen. There's going to be martial law, and I'm like, why are you of all people worried about it? So it's interesting how provincialism sometimes can be like the ultimate sort of vehicle for fear and xenophobia.
Yeah, all those militias in Michigan. It's nuts, man. So your mom comes across as a hero in this book. I mean, man, talk about a tough lady with everything that she went through. And on top of that, even trying to help your friend Will with his stuttering. Going to give away food and Christmas. And she just comes across as a saint in this book. Is she doing all right up north? Is everything going well for her?
Yeah, she's well. And it was a question some people asked me about the book prior to it being published are you making her into too much of a Madonna character? Is she too saintly? Characters should be complicated as we are. But she really does live that life, She's very selfless and she was what held everything together through all that. A very quiet, humble woman, but it teaches me a lot about, the strongest person isn't necessarily the one making all the noise and flashing their bicep or weapon or whatever. So yeah, but she's doing all right. It's peaceful up there. I think the winters are pretty brutal, but I think it's a good spot for her. Yeah.
It was just such a kick in the balls what happened with the cat, like after she goes through all that.
God,
and I like how you're talking about the dog and the cat after all this deep stuff going through, You're like, we're talking about animals, we're talking about pests, but we're really not. You know, it's kind of like the subtext of what you're talking about and the metaphor there. But
yeah, thanks
glad
for
to hear
noticing
she's
that.
doing well.
Yeah, thank you.
So you're back in touch with Nathan now because you guys just had this reunion
Yes.
thing. Is he doing well?
He's doing well. He lives.
I kind of knew him back in the day a little
maybe
bit.
a mile from here.
Does he?
Yeah. Oh, so you knew him a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't remember how.
Well, he was like the coffee shop king of Main Street.
Yeah. I knew that he worked there, and I saw him there a lot, but that's not how I met him. And then there was Eric. Who else did he play with you? Or?
Eric Prozac.
Yeah, because
Okay.
I don't know if they were in a band for a little while.
Yeah.
Or
Yep.
Maybe I knew them through that.
Okay.
And I know Eric worked with Dave Feeney.
Okay. Oh,
in
the other
Ferndale.
Eric. Okay, not Eric Prozac. No, that's Eric
Milchowski.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I knew that Eric.
Yeah. Good guy.
Yeah.
Who was in the Holy Fire for a minute? Eric.
Oh, was he?
For a minute. Yeah.
So let's talk about the Holy Fire for a second because that's when I was in my band, and I remember you guys. I remember you came out of nowhere, and you were super
really
popular, and you kind of mentioned in the book, like, I don't know how it happened. All of a sudden, we're getting all this attention, and you made that transition, completely different kind of music, and you were getting some accolades, you were touring, and then it seemed like pretty early on you decided, no, this isn't working at all. Like it was pretty clear to you.
Yeah.
What was the main thing there that just wasn't feeling right?
Yeah, I mean, it really did come on. I'd been working on another band for a while that just wasn't happening, and I met that drummer at a bar in Dearborn, and we basically just over drinks before ever playing together said we're going to write a record and record it. And we did that in a month or two, and yeah, we just came out and went for it. And around town at the time, it felt like, we were a band people were talking about. And before we knew it, we were recording with the guy from Flaming Lips.
Yeah.
Who was producing us.
And then you opened for TV on the radio?
That was our first show.
It was your first show?
Yeah.
Wow.
So it was just one of those things where everything fell into place, and we were, for a moment, obsessed with going for it. And yeah, I wasn't in a healthy spot, and some other people in that group were not in a healthy spot. And I think about 3 years into it, you realize how much really goes into having a sustainable band, to really go out there and make it happen, especially at the beginning. I mean, you need, I guess there are some bands that are train wrecks and it just kind of holds together. It's a lot. I mean, it's to go out and get in a van and travel around and deal with the industry and.
So was that more the reason you got out of it, or was it creatively you didn't feel like it was?
I just had that intuition. I remember when it was one of those things. I remember I was in some godforsaken like Motel 6 with like, all the guys sleeping one night, and something happened, and I was like, I have to get out of this the next day. But I knew in my heart it wasn't going to happen. And also we had a contract to do an album with this label, and there was going to be an advance, and I wanted to record it and document it, but I knew I wasn't going to be able to tour with those guys, and I just didn't want to take somebody's money and just throw it away out of vanity, I guess. So there was personal stuff, and also, I mean, if you read the book, you'll know that I wasn't in a great spot mentally at that time, and I think sometimes when you're there, you can fixate on one thing. This is going to fix everything in my life.
Mm-hmm.
If only we'd become a band that makes a living doing this, everything will be all right. And that wasn't going to be the case. I had some other work to do. So
yeah, I thought that was a pretty insightful reflection on that, because when you think about like the addiction issues you had and the kind of simmering self-destructive kind of nature, you throw some fame on top of that or some notoriety, that's usually what does people in. And you mentioned the book, like, man, I shudder to think of where this would have gone. Like, you're almost happy that it didn't go anywhere because of what that could have meant for your own health.
Yeah, I don't think that band was poised for fame, but maybe at best like a real low-level club tour kind of thing, and I would have died.
Just enough to ensure enough of a paycheck to do enough drinking and drugs to get you on tour every year.
Yeah.
Just that lifestyle. It's a killer lifestyle.
I wouldn't have made it. I think my body knew that, and some people can live like that for a long time, and I did for a while, but I don't think my DNA was built for it.
So at your worst, you were drinking every day?
Mm-hmm. At the worst.
Yeah.
And that was a baseline thing for me. And once I drank, I'd put anything on top of it, basically. So,
right.
And I mean, the other unspoken thing about this in the book is, I mean, trauma is a thing where something like losing my sister happens, and you're not really able to process at that age. In fact, you'll do anything almost to avoid that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I needed space to just fall apart at some point, and I didn't realize that.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, we're going to do this band, it's going to fix everything. So that's where I was at.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect storm of things that could happen if you have that tendency, to really go off the deep end. You know? But it speaks a lot to you that you were able to come out of that. Like, that's a huge deal, man. That's great.
Yeah.
How long have you been sober now?
It'll be 9 years in December. So
congratulations.
It's the major accomplishment of my life, certainly.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
With with my field, I deal with a lot of liver disease and alcoholism and stuff, and I know the success rate is just dismal, and it's a hard thing to do. It's one of the hardest things you can do.
Yeah, I mean, I was having a lot of premature gastro stuff from the pills and the booze, and it was like scary. Like 25, being scoped out, and them telling you.
Yeah. There's another example of brutal things you decided to include, all the bleeding and all that stuff. Jesus Christ.
Yeah. I might do it differently than that, but...
No, but I think it's good. I mean, like, it just kept the punches coming. Like, it was brutal, but it's part of what made it engaging, you're pulling for you. The reader's pulling for you to come through it. So you mentioned you made yourself maybe seem like too much like of a fuck up, but I think you had a good kind of window into your, despite all the fucked up shit you did, a good window into, you're a good person underneath it, and you were striving anyway to be a moral person, and you need something like that so that the reader's pulling for you to like have an investment in you, know. So yeah, it's good to hear that all turned out. There's a lot of addiction stuff with some of the other characters in the book. Have you kept in touch with Will, for example? How's he doing?
Yeah, ironically or coincidentally, we didn't speak for a couple years, but we've been speaking since I've been back. And I mean, he's basically a brother to me, and
he's another good character for the movie. All of his outfits.
Yeah, and he's again like just this guy who's like, man, if you found the right niche to put you in, you would have been the best at what you do, but I don't know what that niche is. I'm just a special guy.
Yeah, that's the rub with like super creative people. If they have an outlet that it has to be some kind of practical application in normal society to allow them to thrive. But so much of the time it's not. It's just the nature of art and creativity. It's like a lot of the times there's no financial outlet. There's no way you can kind of ingratiate yourself into regular society and still be that unique character.
Right.
But if you can, to me, that seems to be like the ideal of living your life. Because art at its best, I think, is completely authentic and an expression of your creativity. And if you can do that, and in a way that allows you to kind of walk around amongst everybody else who's kind of doing their day-to-day 9-to-5 job, but doesn't have that kind of expression or that ability to express themselves, I think that's like the highest level you can live your life, But it's not easy, like making money off being a musician or writing a novel or being a poet. Like it's just really tough to do,
Yeah, I mean, I'll be 40 by the end of the year, and I'm still constantly reminding myself, like, you're probably not going to stop doing this stuff, because sometimes I think, what if I'd put all this energy into making money? Things would be different, but it's just what I want to do while I'm here, and I still have to accept that over and over again. I think some people don't have that, to work through. But yeah, and then there's this other thing going on now where it's like a lot of people branding themselves, and that's like the main sort of thrust of what they're doing. And I don't know, are you an artist, or are you selling some identity on Instagram, and what is that? And trying to navigate that as someone who's trying to survive in like a creative realm,
like performance art, reality, character.
Yeah, or how much of it is
types.
real, or even writers now. Well, they have a YouTube channel and an Instagram thing. I'm like, oh, I kind of read and write to get away from that. And how does this? So, yeah, it's interesting how creative people make it or don't. But someone said something to me. It was like at one of these literary panels, but it was just a writer was talking, or maybe it was an artist actually, and say there's this myth that artists tend to be scattered and they don't know where they are, and you kind of have to prop them up. But he was saying most of the artists he who's sustained some kind of living are extremely organized people, which is not me. Mm-hmm. But I strive for that. And I think that's maybe in sort of line with what you're talking about. Like if you can figure that out and still have your senses open to all that creative influence and be functional, well, that's pretty good.
Right.
Which I'm working at.
Yeah, some things you can learn, like creativity, or being organized is like a skill you can work on,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's tough. But I'm complete opposite end of the spectrum of like the creative type. I'm kind of obsessed with artists because it's something that it's so different for me that I wish I could do. And I try, like I like creating stuff, even though it's very, like I can't write a song, but I'll write a riff on the guitar, and just creating something at all is kind of a fun endeavor. Mm-hmm. But it's a skill that it seems mysterious to me.
Yeah, I guess when I think back to getting my guitar, which I wanted drums, but I had a paper route and the guitar was cheaper, and that's how I wound up with a guitar. And I never learned any other songs. From the minute I got it, I was trying to make my own.
Really?
It was my impulse to do that. And I don't know why. You think you would want to learn how to play Led Zeppelin or something.
Right.
So that's just my 12-year-old brain was, how do I make my own thing?
Yeah, I think you're just born with that, Like, I think everybody has that desire to express themselves, and it's just a matter of finding that tool, Mm-hmm. And when you realize that, I can write songs, and you feel like you're expressing something about yourself to other people, that's kind of a exhilarating thing, I bet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, can't do it. Still looking. Maybe the podcast thing. This will be my expression.
Yeah.
But were you doing a lot of interviews and stuff for the book back when it was published? Was it kind of getting overwhelming? Like, wow, I can't believe like all the attention you're getting for this book? Or
it was more just overwhelming, talking about myself. So it was such a weird thing. You write a book about yourself, and then you're talking about yourself while you're, simultaneously overwhelmed with the idea that anyone in my life is going to be able to read this at the same time.
Yeah.
And I just felt like I'm just talking about myself, and I'm also trying to steer things through what I'm saying in interviews. And it just, it was really exhausting at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I really liked the opportunity to be able to speak about it a little bit, particularly for, maybe people who know me or know my family, if they, just don't understand a piece of literature like that. Well, why would somebody want to do that? And maybe it helps somebody understand, not that they're tuning into my interviews, but it feels good just to talk about it.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it's weird just talking to somebody. It's so one-sided. When you read a book that's so personal, like I know so much about your life, and you know nothing about me. Like that's got to be kind of weird. Did you ever feel like when you talk to people, like I don't really feel like talking about this deep personal stuff that I wrote about, like almost second guessing putting it all out there, or is it Never been.
I mean, there was I swear to you, I woke up every day for 6 months. The first thought, what have I done after it came out, which was tough. But I don't get tired of speaking about it. But people's reaction, like as you said, like acquaintances of mine, or even friends who I don't get into those kind of conversations with, and now they've read this. And also something I had to let go of was, I mean, we just don't know how anybody else is going to take anything about us, and I have no idea what people's brains have done with that book, or what scenes they've held on to that for them characterize how they characterize me or whatever. And that's if you think I was thinking about that stuff too much to the point where it was, I have to let this go, and it's just not my problem anymore. But it is kind of like walking through the fire sometimes. Like, hey, you put this out there, you show up and look this person in the eye, and you know that they've read that, and have to stand behind it. But I mean, I've had everything from like a guy come up to me and tell me, I read your book. It was like walking in on a friend masturbating. Like, oh, thank you. To people saying the most profound things and sharing with me the most profound things, and that human connectivity, which is really what I think art is about at the end of the day. So, yeah, definitely a range of.
How many people do you think read the book?
I don't know.
Is that an easy thing to keep track of?
I mean, I know how many copies it sold, and then there's libraries, and
so like I bought it on my iPhone, like in the iTunes store. Like when that happens,
okay. You read it on a reader.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So, like, is that easy to keep track of? Is there like a place you can go and see how many of your ebooks have sold?
Like my agent probably knows that stuff. I don't really look at it. I know it did. It had a feature at Barnes and Noble, and it had really good distribution with Random House, and I know how many copies shipped, and it went to paperback. So for a book in this day and age, it got out there pretty well, which is all I could ask for.
Yeah.
So.
And your next book, the novel you're working on, is that going to be through the same publishing group?
I'm not sure yet. Yeah.
So far, has this been harder to write, or how is it compared to the memoir? Or is it just completely different?
One thing I realized right away was working from memory, where you're constantly going back and trying to animate memory through scene. That's what I was doing for 4 years, and now I'm bringing my present tense kind of obsessions, who I am now, and trying to process through these characters and through fiction. So as far as like a book taking shape, this has been a lot harder because anything can happen. Whereas with the memoir, it's like I have these events to work with, and how does it make sense to put them in place? So it's been a real challenge. I also didn't make it easy on myself. I mean, there's books that like follow one character and happen in a weekend. This is numerous characters and building towards this thing. So it's been a really challenging project, but feels fresh to be able to get at what I'm thinking about now instead of going back to the past. Yeah.
What's your writing process? Do you set out a time of the day every day you write? Do you write in the same place every day? Do you have kind of strategies?
I'm pretty ritualistic about I need to be in this one spot where my stuff is. And when I'm doing well, I'm writing every day in like probably 3-4 hours right now, which is pretty good. Like you hear about people getting up to like that 8-hour mark, and I'd love to get that kind of endurance, but it's surprisingly exhausting work.
Yeah, no, I believe it for sure. Yeah, characters, that's like one of the things of a good writer, like developing good characters, and so you get a good idea of, in a picture of your mind of the characters you're reading about. And I like Tom Wolfe, for example, I read some of his books, and like just the complexity of the picture he draws of these characters is so amazing. And I wonder if writers like yourself, when you are living your life, are you constantly thinking about your novel and picking things from people that think, oh, that'd be a good character, or I'm going to create this
just
person?
always. To a point where I'm like, sometimes like I have to shut it off, or I should be taking more notes because I'm always... Often, I mean, someone tells you a cool story of something that happened, or someone gestures a certain way, or someone's got, human behavior and you're observing it. And, you know, the writing I like most is the kind where it's just showing characters doing things. And if you're a smart enough reader, you're able to figure out, well, they're behaving this way because of this, and it's not telling you why you're feeling it. So when I'm having those experiences, I'm constantly like, what does this mean in the context of a piece of art? So yeah.
What about writing women characters? That always seemed to me particularly difficult because it's so different from your own personal experience, you know. And like Tom Wolfe would write these characters like this, you know, 65-year-old female divorcee, and like in these ways that you just felt like this was.
Yeah, some people are really good at it.
Yeah. How do you do that? Like, how do you?
Well, I'm writing my first woman character now as part of this novel, so yeah, it's really trying to sit with it and, you know, have some kind of empathy that's beyond the you know, borders of your own experience for sure. Yeah.
So a little bit change of subject, but like you're not with Lauren or Angela these days.
No.
And moving on, let me know. I know you got to go soon.
Oh yeah, I'm good.
Do you mainly date artistic women, or do you try and go the other way? Because I know Lauren was not the artist type, but Angela kind of was, right? She was kind of,
yeah.
In your later years, as you are you single? Or are you married?
I'm single. Yeah.
And are you? I imagine you're probably drawn to creative people, but
sure.
How does that work with you? With your dating?
Yeah, I really need that language between us. I really do, and it especially. I mean, I have to tell you when you're. It's really important to me to be with someone who reads, and we can have that. It's such a big part of my life now, and as we were talking about earlier, that piece of the culture is really slimming down. I mean, it's hard to find people who read books, which to me is kind of a tragedy. I don't think it's going anywhere, but the amount of people who are engaged with it is much less. So, yeah, you know. A smart woman reading a great novel is probably like, you know,
that's high on their list.
It's not
easy to find. Yeah. That's kind of a double-edged sword of anytime you get into a niche type of culture, like you're limiting the amount of other people you're going to meet that are into that thing as well.
Yeah.
You know, when you're in this hardcore music scene, you talk about Lauren, like listening to Dave Matthews or something. Like, she's never going to get that part of it. But maybe music, you can get beyond that if you have other things that you can connect with. But yeah, something like of how you see the world and how engaged you are and how much you read and how curious of a person you are.
Yeah.
That's important to me too.
Yeah, I think there's a depth that comes with readers that, you know, I mean, it's not to say you won't have it without a reading life, but I think it would be hard for me at this point to be with someone who just didn't read. So...
I'm kind of with you on that. Like I'm almost getting militant about this. Like I think, like this whole reality TV thing. I think it's analogous to eating, fast food. Like, I think it's
absolutely.
bad for your brain. I think people say, "Oh, it's a guilty pleasure, whatever, watch it." But I think you should, even if you're drawn to it, you should actively fight against it and not watch it. I think you have to have some discipline with that. You know,
this strange reflection of like the worst of our culture and. Yeah, I don't know if you've read any Susan Sontag. I teach it a little bit. She was just a kind of eminent intellectual in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and a great figure for women as well. But she wrote a lot about photography, and she was concerned about photography like in the 70s, saying as a culture we need to diet on the recorded image because it's losing its power. We're looking at too many photographs.
Oh, really?
We need to make sure that they're still able to have impact. And now we're living in a culture where the image is everything. And, you know, as you said, I think it's become so easy for someone to turn on a TV. And I haven't had a TV since I was a kid, so when I am somewhere and someone turns on the reality TV, I feel like I'm a bit of an alien looking in, like, wait, what are we watching right now? Just this bizarre sort of documentation of, and even like these channels like National Geographic, and it seems like they're all sort of like sort of gravitating towards that kind of programming. It's bizarre.
Yeah. I put Susan Sontag in my phone. What was the psychologist, philosopher you mentioned earlier?
Adam Phillips.
Adam
Highly
Phillips.
recommended. Yeah.
I'll look into that too.
Missing Out, I would start with him.
All right. Yeah, I I don't know if it's me just getting older or whatever, cranky, but I'm turning into like a misanthrope. I feel like I gotta like balance this out a little bit. Like I just get frustrated with people, you know.
I do too. I mean, I have to let go. It's not healthy to be so frustrated by something you can't control, but it's also like it's everywhere and it's affecting your psyche. Another huge part of it is that, you know, obviously the companies manufacturing this stuff have a single bottom line. They're going to sell as much to you as they can as cheaply as possible. So I think they've mastered this thing. They've got people just tapping that pleasure sensor, you know.
Get the dopamine bump from whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have mastered it, and they're still getting better.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of dark side of neuroscience, and we're starting to figure out the brain and what makes it tick, and that opens up portals for people to take advantage of, you know. And that's why this guy Bernays, he's one of the first guys to figure this out. But as you get better and better of learning about this, your tools are going to get more finely honed to get what you need. So yeah, it's pretty wild to watch where things are going to go.
Mm-hmm. It's not going to slow down. We can count on that.
Yeah. So are you you enjoying being back in Detroit and Ferndale? It's a big change from New York.
I still haven't moved into my place. I have to say it's just one of those things where you know it's going to feel some way, but you're not sure how until you get there. And it's much different being back here and saying, I'm going to try to live here again versus visiting. Mm-hmm. So it's been a little bit of an existential whirlwind for sure, because this is also the place like where everything in my life happened up until a certain point, and the smells and the air and the dialect, and it's all so. It's been a really interesting experience so far, but it's only been barely a month. So,
and has it brought back any interest in the music stuff being back home? I know you did that reunion. Are you planning on doing more music going forward?
I have always played in a band in some way. Like I had a band in New York the whole time, and it was kind of like a secret band. Like it was a bunch of guys who tried to do all that and say we don't have any time for anything but showing up and playing. So I've actually already played with a friend a few times, and I'd like to have a band around Detroit that can go out and do something without, you know, getting too serious about it. So,
right.
Yeah.
Would it be more along the lines of Holy Fire or thoughts of ENS?
Probably neither. Probably something a little weirder and moodier, and yeah.
And are you gonna get a teaching gig around here? Is that?
I have a teaching gig at U of D.
Oh yeah.
Most schools have a creative writing program, which is basically art class for writing. So this isn't your like American lit class or the kind of English criticism side of things. It's more like art school. So yeah, I teach I'll assign them very contemporary reading, and then there's a workshop component where they're trying to make their own pieces, and we're sort of assessing them and talking about them. So it's cool. It's pretty cool, you know.
So it's a little bit of a hybrid of how to write and how to
read like a writer, as opposed to how to read like a scholar. So yeah.
And what percentage of your students think read your book?
Ooh.
I would imagine most. I would be so curious if I had a teacher that had
a
book.
Some dig them up. I do, while class is in session, try to not mention it and steer them away from that, just because, again, as we were talking about earlier, like, there's always the one that goes out and reads it right away, and then, you know, maybe they're just kind of looking at you like, what the? So I'm not sure, but I know some of them have. I've had some great students. Yeah.
Is it pretty obvious when students hand in their writing? Is there a pretty big distinction between ones you can tell have talent right away versus is it pretty obvious early on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
So I imagine that with any talent, it is like you can pick out the talented musicians pretty quick just by their rate of progress and improvement.
Yeah,
Same
and there's different talents, but you'll see something, and it's interesting. I mean, I was always like very sloppy, but had a kind of lot of inspiration, you know, and some of my work was like trying to rein it in and control it. And so you see that, or you see someone who's just this masterful technician, but hasn't figured out how to tell a story. So you see little glimmers. Yeah. Yeah.
And you're still, I'm sure, trying to learn and grow as a writer. How do you, once you are out, you're teaching, you're trying to write, how do you get better as a writer? Just reading, basically? Just studying other works that you really...
Yeah, it's a lot of reading and just looking at studying what your influences did and the greats, and then just a lot of sitting down and trial and error and, you know, working through that. So
I got a pretty good idea of your musical inspirations or you know, people that inspired you. What about writing? Do you have a handful of writers that you look to as somebody you want to aspire to?
Yeah, I read a lot and widely, and I read a lot of stuff that's very currently published, like what are the new books coming out. And the amazing thing is that there's no shortage of genius pieces of literature being published. It's just less.
Yeah, it's kind of depressing, actually. Like there's so many books you'll never read. So many amazing books you just don't have the time to read.
Yeah. So, you know, that's still thriving. But for me, the entry drug was Henry Miller. I read Tropic of Capricorn in high school, and it completely changed, you know, my neurotransmitters or something. But as far as the memoir, I mean, there's this little book of collected linked short stories called Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson, who every American should read. And it was just very close to my heart.
Put that one on my phone too, then.
Yeah, you know, and it's so much about voice and has nothing to do with plot, and it's a lost guy kind of meandering through a very problematic life, and there's just this, you know, this beauty to the language and to this kind of distraught character's impressions of a pretty horrible, you know, a pretty horrible world he's living in. And so Dennis Johnson, who just died about a month ago, is someone who's very close to my heart. You know, like when you hear certain things or read certain things and you just feel like you're being spoken to by some like archetypal version of yourself or something. He is really,
that for you?
Yeah. And then also a guy named Robert Stone, who passed away recently. He wrote these books, Dog Soldier, and one called A Flag for Sunrise, which were like American classics in their time but have disappeared from the conversation for whatever reason. But yeah, so there's a number of them out there. Also Sam Shepard, who just died, who was a playwright.
All your heroes are dying.
Yeah, they're all dying. Yeah.
Did you ever try and reach out to them and meet them?
Oddly enough, I tried to interview Sam Shepard this year, and his publicist said he's not doing interviews, and then a month later he's dead. So at least I know why he turned down the interview.
It's a pretty good reason, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really glad you didn't turn down this interview. It's super cool of you, man, because like obviously this isn't a huge operation here, and it was really fun for me to be able to talk to you and hear kind of where your life went after the book, and it's great to hear you doing so well. And I'll definitely keep my eyes out if you play any music downtown. I'll be there. Check it out.
Thank you very much for
follow your writing career.
Yeah.
This novel.
Yeah,
it's got to be so daunting. I mean, it just seems so intimidating to write a novel.
It is, but I think just the one thing I can come back to is, and I think it probably holds true for anything, is if you can just return to the practice and the work, that's all you can do. And when I start thinking about it too much, I'm done.
Yeah. All right, man.
Yes, thank you very much.
Appreciate it, brother.
Yeah.
Listen to that drumming, man. Little taste of Facianesco here. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. It's just amazing that Sean can make these noises. Next episode is going to be a little different. I'm actually talking to a dominatrix, and I'm going to her studio, wherever she does her thing, and it should be interesting. So that'll be coming out soon, and I'll see you next time.